Well, we've been spending some time discussing the logic having to do with categorical propositions, the idea of things like all men are mortal, where they're things that are asserting relations between different categories, and that's what makes the arguments good ones or bad ones. That is, that what makes certain conclusions follow from premises and certain conclusions that aren't. But now that we're talking about, propositional logic, where the components are not categories, not predicates, not properties, but rather entire statements, entire propositions. We just spent some time on disjunction, either-ors, and that does, the either-or kind of logic does play a very important role in our reasoning, our everyday reasoning, and our reasoning about philosophy. But we're now going to get into, the issue of, conditional propositions or hypothetical propositions. And you're probably wondering, what the heck is a conditional proposition or a hypothetical? You may or may not know, but a hypothetical is something that could be the case. You say, well, let's assume it's hypothetically. We'll assume it's the case, or conditional on a certain condition. Well, the kind of propositions we're talking about are things like, and look at it, it might be analogous to that all men are mortal. If Socrates is a man, then Socrates is mortal. Okay, and notice that it's saying that if he's a man, it's mortal. Is that saying that Socrates is a man? No. Is it saying that he's mortal? It's not saying that either of those two propositions is true, right? There's the proposition that Socrates is a man. There's a proposition that Socrates is mortal. But what it's asserting is there's a relationship between the two. That is, if the first one is true, then the second one is true. Notice the analogy to that all men mortal. We're going to come back to that a little bit later. But there are other contexts in which we have these conditional, these hypothetical propositions. We hear this all the time in science. When you were a little kid, maybe even in high school, you were said, well, gee, if you mix hydrogen and oxygen, then you get water. Way to put that: hydrogen and oxygen are mixed, then water is formed. If they're mixed, does it say that water is formed? No. Is it saying that hydrogen and oxygen is mixed? No. It's if you do it, then you're going to have a certain consequence. People use reasoning like that in talking about issues of science. Sometimes it's just a matter of definition, like in number 3. If Ashley's a mother, then Ashley is female, or a female. The idea is there's a relationship between those two. And I picked Ashley on purpose because Ashley is a name that is used for both men and women. So just from the fact that we use the name, can't make any assumption, although you don't remember this. There was a country western singer, Johnny Cash. Maybe you saw the movie about Johnny Cash's life, but he had a song, A Boy Named Sue. So I think the message in that is, just from the fact that the name sounds female, don't assume anything. But what we can assume is that this conditional is true. That is, or the hypothetical is true. If Ashley is a mother, then Ashley is female. And here's one that we're going to use to really understand which kind of inferences using if-thens are good and bad. And it's going to come up a bunch of times. If the president is in the White House, then he's in Washington, D.C. Right? Yeah. Because the White House is in Washington, D.C. Now notice they are all asserting a connection between one proposition and another. In number 1, the two propositions are Socrates is a man and Socrates is immortal, and saying if the first one's true, the second one's true. Or it might even be saying, if you want to think of it in categorical terms, all times when that first one is true are times when that second one is true. Same thing, if there's a relationship between hydrogen and oxygen being mixed and the proposition that water is formed. connection between Ashley's being a mother. Ashley is a mother, the truth of that, and the truth of Ashley is a female. And with regard to the geographic location of the White House, if the president and the president's, if the president's in the White House, then the president, he is in Washington. So just to repeat, all times when that first proposition is true, that second proposition is also true. Now, when we're looking at it, just want to get some terms straight when we're talking about conditional propositions, if-then statements, or hypothetical propositions. And let's focus on if Socrates is a man, then Socrates is mortal, because we're asserting the if-then relationship between two propositions. Socrates is a man and Socrates is mortal. And the first proposition, Socrates is man, is something called the antecedent. And ante is a prefix, before. So antecedent is the prior part of the condition, what happened before. Now the conditional proposition, the if-then, is asserting a relationship between the first proposition and the second proposition, that is, that Socrates is mortal. And this second proposition is called the consequent. You think like consequences, what happens after, and me following as a result. So the truth of the prior proposition implies the truth of the consequent proposition, the second one. So the truth of the antecedent, what an if-then is telling you is if the antecedent is true, then the consequent is also true. But I just want you to be aware, and these are terms that we're going to use pretty freely, so make sure you know which one the antecedent is and which one the consequent is.